All right, welcome everybody to our class. Just kidding. With the worst teacher you could possibly have. Just kidding. There's worse. There's definitely worse. But today I'm gonna try to show you a tutorial, I guess, on how to paint skin. But I mean, doing tutorials for these kind of things is always difficult because there's always layers to everything. So I'm gonna try to explain like those layers, and then I'll try to give you the quick tips, I guess, for painting skin that I personally know. Keep in mind that I'm still very much a student, so I don't know everything, and some of this may be misguided. So just know that I'm not a pro. So the first layer of skin tones and that kind of thing. So obviously, let's say you already know how to draw a face. So I'm not gonna talk about painting faces or anything. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to tell you how to paint skin. So you already know how to draw the face, whatever. We're not gonna worry about the anatomy of the body or the face or anything like that. The first layer, the thing that you have to worry about is your values. So when you're painting skin, if you don't have good values, then the skin won't look good. The skin tone will be off, and your saturations and everything will be off, to be honest. So that's why it's important to get your values down right before. So a tip for that is to actually just work in um, black and white, and then do a color layer, and it kind of experiment with color layers. I would say that's probably a good start. You could also just start by trying out color right away. And I know some people like to color pick, so like they'll look at images and color pick and look at, you can see the brightness and um, the values of the color by looking at the little square thing or the triangle. Um, so that's two ways that you can tackle what's it called, values. I'm actually gonna show you an example of like values, because oftentimes, like, if your skin color isn't looking right or there's something just a little off, it's probably your values. It's probably not the color you chose or the saturation. It might be, but it's oftentimes, especially for newer artists, it'll be your values. So I'm going to show you an example of um, values, how values affect uh, like your painting. Okay, so to illustrate this point of the importance of values in skin tone, I'm going to use some of my pieces. These are somewhat old. Actually, most of them I did them about a year ago or more before, so there's been a lot of time since then, but I will use them nonetheless because I think they're good examples to what I want to show. So first I want to show these two. Um, Here's one issue you can have with your values. You can obviously outright just pick the wrong value. Like if you're trying to make a pale girl, you make it too dark, or you're trying to make a dark you're trying to paint a dark skin color and you make it too light. Obviously there's that error, and then there's errors when you're picking your values in a sense of uh like your local values, I guess. So what I mean by that is so for this girl, here my local value for, let's say, her cheek area is right here. It's this right there. And then her shadow is down right there. So while yes, it did get much darker, there isn't much contrast, so there isn't much difference between these two areas when this area is protruding out towards us and this area is um a it's a hole. How would you explain it? Like it's a, it should be in shadow, like sort of, you can just see it in my eyes. Like I have deep set eyes, not extremely, but because of that I just have natural shadows right there. Anyways, that's what I'm trying to say. And because of that, there should be more contrast between the two values. So you can kind of just try to use your logic with this. It obviously takes experience and practice to build up knowledge on this kind of stuff, but so I'm going to try showing you what happens when I increase the contrast between those two areas. So I can do that by either darkening the shadows or brightening up the highlight. But considering that that the shadows aren't very dark, I'm gonna go for that first. So I think we can all agree that this does look better. But now I have to work on everything else. Basically darken everything else that should have been darker. And nostrils should always be dark as hell. They're literally gaping holes in your nose. It's funny though, because now that the values are right, you can see how the color is completely off. So it looks kind of weird, like it almost looks worse. Um, but it's only because the values are so bad in this version that the color, just using a color layer, using the same colors as before, and now you get to see like how bad those colors actually are. So now we can talk about color. What's wrong? What's wrong with color? What's wrong here? Here's sort of the things that you can try to just memorize, like the quick tips, I guess, to memorize when you're painting skin. So first of all, why the my shadows are extremely saturated, uh, extremely saturated, and my highlights are green desaturated. So let's just kind of neutralize everything so it doesn't look as crazy. Um, let's desaturate everything too. Okay, so I actually don't want it to be like that. Let's just do this and then erase the hair. Okay, so things to remember. Highlights are desaturated, midtones are saturated, and shadows are desaturated. So before, when we were just kind of throwing colors on there, hoping that it would work out, somehow we'd get a skin tone. And after using that highlights, desaturated shadows, and saturated midtones, um, and then obviously for some reason I didn't paint the skin tone, like I didn't pinken the lips. Um, but yeah, there's just the overall concept. Just I didn't try to fix any of the anatomy. There's tons of issues with the anatomy. I didn't try to fix anything with the anatomy. I Actually, I kind of did a little tiny bit with the nose. Um, well, not really. It was more addressing the values. The thing is that everything in art is related. Like you can't just separate everything. Values is how you show form. Form changes the anatomy, etc. So it's not like you can just practice one thing alone. A lot of the times, it's always going to be mixed. But I tried my best to just address the values, and I hope that you notice like the difference between this and this. Um, well, actually, I suppose this would be the difference between the values, this right here, and then addressing color within skin. Um, you go to here. So the difference between this and this is literally just values and color. So you don't need to know much more. I didn't really change the anatomy. Um, Although to know your values, you need to know some anatomy, because for example, like right here we have dimples, so they're darker there. You have it's deeper here, so you get shadows there, etc. Like I said, everything's tied together, so try not to separate them in your mind. Always think about them together. Without light, there's no form. With no form, there's no anatomy. With no light, there's no form, there's no anatomy. So they're always tied together. But so there's that. That's just a whole little preface to this whole thing. And so I suggest that if you're working in color, that you sometimes just take the time to make it grayscale, and then just looking at your values. And really thinking about it. Why is this value this dark? Why is this value this light? Should they really be this similar in value? Maybe there should be more contrast, or maybe they're not that different areas and they shouldn't be so contrasted. You can kind of get your way around it with logic, but it also just takes a lot of practice and mindful studying, so don't give up or anything. The next thing, I'll try to just talk about what I know about painting colors and different skin tones and that kind of thing. So in this part, I'm going to be doing basically what everybody actually wants, the tutorial on painting skin. I'm going to be painting 3 skin tones, pale, in between, and dark. And I'll just be kind of explaining my overall thoughts on things in skin. I should have saved more time for this part, but whatever. I don't want to make this video too long. So when you're painting pale skin, as with any of these skin tones, try to stay a little bit on the desaturated side when you start out. Don't start on the saturated side. Save that for special occasions, I guess. Pale skin is very translucent, so you'll have a lot of pink in your transition colors, meaning from shadows to your midtones, there will be more pinker saturation, and from your highlights to your midtones, there's sort of a pinker saturation there as well. With any of these, the shadows can be as dark as black. It really just depends on your environment, but think about the local color. If they're pale, typical shadows won't be as dark because they are pale. Their local color is brighter. Their highlights are, this is something to keep in mind with pale skin or whiter skin, is because they're so pale, highlights don't typically take very much focus, so there isn't much contrast between the highlight and the midtone just because they are so pale. So when you're painting lighter skin, try not to focus on the highlights and more on like the midtones and using shadows to show form. The highlights really won't show unless, or they won't be that obvious unless you have certain lighting. And then in darker skin, you can use brighter highlights. There's more contrast between the highlight and the midtone, and as with any, like I said before, the shadows can get as dark as black depending on the environment. I also like to saturate darker skin a little more than I do with pale skin, and I really like pushing the saturation in those transition tones between the shadow and so where the shadow starts to end, and same thing when the highlight starts to end. I really like to saturate those areas. Is there anything else? With darker skin, the highlights really are very obvious. They're very pronounced because there's so much contrast between the light that's hitting them and their dark skin. It always depends on the environment and the lighting setting, but typically the highlights are a lot more obvious on darker skin, and it's a lot of fun to try to play around with showing form with different rim lights and different colors and spotlights and such. But again, their shadows can be as dark as black. They won't be as obvious, again, because when local color is so dark, shadows can only be so much darker, if that makes sense, so there isn't as much contrast. But there's still, of course, shadows, and I still like to do transition tones with saturation and push that saturation near transition tones. Something else is that with any of these, try to use neutral, desaturated highlights, desaturated shadows, and then save your saturation for those midtones. And then with lighting, it always depends, but typically your lighting is desaturated. However, if your lighting is, for example, like a bright blue, then obviously you can use a blue for your highlights and such. Use the color of the light to color the highlights of the skin. So don't just assume, for example, oh, she's brown, so let me just use a lighter brown or something like that. If she's brown but the light is a bright white, then use white to paint the highlights. If she's brown but there's like a bright blue light, then use a bright blue to paint the highlights, if that makes sense. Try to use the light for highlights, not necessarily their skin. So don't just like raise the value in the skin. That's something that you should definitely not do when you're painting skin. It'll look very fake, like clay. In fact, it'll look like a clay instead of real skin. And in general, it'll just look very artificial and not very believable. If you're just going up in value, try to hue shift closer. They always say like hue shift to warmer, I think, for light, but really it just depends on what color your light is. Hue shift towards whatever the color of the light is. And then same thing with the shadows. Typically they're cooler, but they can be warmer. It really depends. It also depends on the look you're going for. But if you just kind of keep in mind that highlights are desaturated and they're the color of the light, midtones are your local color, so the actual skin color of the person, and they can get pretty saturated. And then your shadows are desaturated and I would say like the opposite of your light. So if the light's cool, it's warm, and then if the light's warm, it's cool. But you don't have to follow those exactly. Just play around with light and play around with like the color of your highlight and the color of your shadow. And with practice, you will gain a lot of skill.